Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. Pawns are the weakest and most expendable piece on the chessboard. However, pawns also have a superpower. When they get to the 8th rank, they can transform into one of the other pieces, including the queen. A passed pawn becomes increasingly valuable as it marches up the board. In this game, I had a posse of passed pawns supporting each other, and as we'll see, this effectively locked the opponent's pieces from play. Please enjoy! So let's have a quick look at the review first. So I played this game very well, I think, and I was pretty happy with my performance. Accuracy of 91.7%. I did have a blunder, but as we'll see, I don't think it was a terrible blunder. Certainly it's not something that that damaged the game. Otherwise, I think I played relatively well. So let's go on to analysis. There we go. And I played black in this game, the opponent white. So they started with the queen's pawn move, which is not something I normally play. And usually in these systems, I just try to develop solidly rather than trying to gambit. So I developed my d pawn to d5. Opponent developed their bishop to f4, which according to chess.com, this is the accelerated London system. I have no special repertoire in this setting other than trying to develop sensibly and solidly. So trying to control the center, develop my pawns, between my pieces, potentially castle. So I developed my knight to f6. Opponent developed their king's pawn to e3. I developed my bishop to f5. So fairly equal at the moment. Now they've got this little pyramid of pawns. I developed my king's pawn, and the opponent now develops knight to f3. I now push my c pawn up to c5, and in this system, it almost looks a little bit like a potential reverse Vienna. And this is quite okay as it's supported by the bishop. They develop the other knight. I now push that pawn forward, thinking that I've now created a connect four of pawns. Now, I didn't really know whether this was good or not, and fairly equal, even though that was not the most accurate move. And I'm happy here as I feel I'm controlling space, particularly on the queen side. Now, the opponent here makes a move that made me think for some time. This sort of aggressive pawn push to b4. I thought they probably made a mistake, though I couldn't exactly see what was happening. And I was sort of aware that there was a potential queen move here that would put me in check. However, I thought I was probably okay, as I could block that with knight to d7. And so in this position, I thought, look, rather than playing conservatively, I decided to get rid of that pawn to try to command the queen side by en passant, which is what I did. So this is apparently a blunder. This was apparently good for white, but I think white needed to play accurately here to get the advantage. So the opponent now pushes out their bishop. I have to admit, I did expect them to move their queen out, which of course also attacks the pawn here. I decided that, look, I'm going to do it anyway. Here they moved their bishop out instead, which I think was a mistake. And same idea, block with knight to d7, which is what I did. The opponent now brings their other knight, potentially now with two attackers. I was fairly sure that this was not a correct move for the opponent, given that this knight is also defended by that knight already. I didn't necessarily see this as a problem. And given that they didn't take care of this pawn, which is of course now hanging really close, I thought pushing the pawn here would be potentially quite powerful, given that it could not be taken with one move. And this bishop, which otherwise isn't doing very much, now protects that pawn if it moves to b2, and it's not particularly easy to dislodge. So that's what I do. Computer thought that that was a great move, which is excellent, and the opponent here thinks for some time, and I think was forced effectively to block with the rook. And this is always often the case when a pawn reaches to the 7th rank, that you end up effectively trading one of the pieces at the back, which often is a rook or queen, for a less valuable piece. And here I can just directly capture that rook with a bishop. That's what I do. Opponent captures back with queen, and now the plan to plant the dark square bishop onto a3, protecting the pawn on b2. So holding on to that position, and this is not easy for the opponent to dislodge. Opponent castles. Here I decide to bring my rook out to c8 with the idea that if the opponent doesn't do anything about that pawn, I could potentially just straight out capture, and then potentially a very powerful attack on what is my 8th rank, but on sort of their back rank, forced to effectively give up pieces. And given that I'm now ahead, I am looking to trade pieces to keep the advantage. No, but the opponent saw that, which is what I expected. Rather than taking here, which would be, I think, a bad move on my part, given that the opponent would have now an attack with a fork on both the bishop and the pawn, I decided to just leave the tension there, but now directly threaten their bishop. And I was potentially hoping that they'll be forced to capture my knight, as then again I'll be able to trade some pieces. However, they withdraw, which was apparently worse for them, but that's okay, given I now have this other attack, and they cannot capture with that pawn, given the immediate move of the rook to c1. The opponent correctly, I think, withdraws the bishop. So now with their active pieces being pulled back to defend, and effectively the defense is centered around this really quite powerful passed pawn on the 7th rank. I'm now free to capture. I'm not sure that did a whole lot for the opponent. And now I just thought now is a good opportunity to try to liquidate some pieces. So I captured that knight. Opponent captures back, which is what I expected. And in this position, I cannot move the knight here. Otherwise, the bishop would sort of have would have an attack on that pawn. Also, need to be careful of this long diagonal as well. So castles here would probably be a serious mistake. So instead, push the pawn forward, and now this pawn has a defender. So now 2 passed pawns staring down at the enemy's back rank. The opponent moves their knight out of the way, which of course makes sense. Now, given that this is now protected, I can move my bishop back, and again, inviting a trade. I want to liquidate pieces. They move their bishop here to give me a check. I didn't really see this as a problem. I could just simply move the king out of the way. Computer reckons that was better. Fair enough. Fair enough. I thought trying to squirrel away the king might be better. Moving there does allow the rook to potentially be developed. So I can understand the Stockfish's evaluation there. They slip the queen out of the way. So at the moment, given there's not something supporting that pawn, it doesn't make sense for it to go there. It would just be lost. But that allowed me to capture, again, trying to liquidate pieces. So got rid of that pesky bishop. Again, happy for them to capture back. The knight here is probably the most active piece. So I was thinking, how can I get rid of that piece? Now, again, I cannot come here, given that this would be a mistake. It's defended by the bishop. So I decide to get my king off my back rank, push that pawn forward. Now that relieves the potential risk from that diagonal, and it also now allows me to bring my king into that little fortress of pawns. Opponent pushes a pawn. I put my king in my little fortress. And now I'm very, very happy. So that knight is sort of bouncing all over the place. I wondered whether or not this would be a potentially good capture, but I thought, no, no, how about we move the queen here, providing pressure and supporting that, that pawn again. That's what I did. Opponent slips their knight back out of the way, and now I've got a battery, so now I really can potentially push that pawn. The opponent does the best move, which is to block that advance with the bishop, but now that bishop is somewhat locked into place, and I saw that there is a now a potential role for moving that a pawn forward to join the attack. I needed to, now that there is the move, I needed to provide extra protection to that pawn. They moved the knight further back to defend. Wasn't entirely sure what they were getting at there. I didn't see that as a problem. And now starting to move the a pawn forward. Moving the, bringing the knight back into my side of the board. And this is where I thought, look, I really needed to get rid of that knight. That knight was pretty much the most active piece for the opponent. As it jumps around, it really can potentially form attacks, with risks of forking my pieces. So here I saw that I could quite safely get rid of that knight, given how strong that knight is. And in doing so, I thought that the opponent would just have no more real chances at forming a counterattack. So that's what I did. And I was very pleased when I did the analysis that chess.com thought that was a brilliant move. Oh, I didn't think it was that brilliant at the time, but clearly it was a good move. So so capture, that makes sense. Queen captures back, and now things, I think, are looking pretty good. Opponent basically doesn't have much to do, so just move another pawn. Now I decided to bring my queen here to both protect that pawn and also putting pressure now on the bishop. The opponent slides their queen back, which I don't think they have very many options, and their pieces now are really locked to these final three ranks close to them, and I'm really capturing the position. So push the pawn forward, bishop forced to retreat, push the pawn forward. Now, very, very powerful. This posse of pawns invading into enemy territory, invading into the courtyard of the enemy castle, effectively. Opponent brings out their rook. Unfortunately, doesn't really help very much. So I bring my rook out, potentially looking at bringing that forward again, forcing some trades. Opponent does make a good move, but very easy to sidestep here now that these pawns are all effectively supporting each other. And the opponent does have to be careful, because if they don't protect this pawn, then I can capture it with check. They make a good move, but, pawn forward again. Each one supporting each other. So this pawn is now supported by this pawn. Happy for them to capture, given that my rook can now capture. They push that pawn forward, effectively now making a third passed pawn. A real, strong group of pawns there. And what I saw here potentially is here with check, with any luck, the opponent might capture, which then would allow me to finally break through. Yep, I do that. The opponent does a reasonable move, blocking with the king. Here, I think they only had seconds left, so 13.1 seconds left. So they're completely out of time. I'm in a completely winning position here. I saw, rather than doing a rush queen trade, which probably is still good for me, potentially I had another check here, and then sooner or later these pawns will be lost. So I am completely in a winning position here. Basically, these pawns on the king side are going to fall, and the opponent flags. They run out of time. Good game. In this game, The advance of my queenside pawns captured a massive space advantage, to the point that the opponent only had pieces on their closest 3 ranks towards the end. The capture of their knight, which could jump over my barricade of pawns, pretty much signaled the end of any effective counterplay. The insight from this game is to not ignore the humble pawn. A group of passed pawns can be extremely difficult to manage. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.